English takes second place because there's a lot of teaching. So I'm in nursing, and with nursing, we always have large groups of students. Okay. So always teaching takes priority. So about in 2017, I went to do a fellowship with Professor Ibrahim. And then that's how I got involved in the conferences and editorial board and everything else, because I went there and that was my opportunity to do some research for 3 months. I was with him. And so I progressed to a bit more into research. But then I went to Plymouth and I was so keen to continue, but work took over. And so I'm more into teaching than doing research itself. So I'm always very interested when people are doing research because it's my passion, but just never get the time to do it. So I always want to hear what people are doing and how they're doing it. And so it was very, very good to hear you say what you were saying, and also for your supervisor to be there and support you, and because not always they are there, mainly right. Because they maybe because of their job they're not able to get some time off, or for various reasons. Sometimes it doesn't happen. So it's very good to see both of you here, and I'm really interested to hear about your project and what you're going to say. I'm looking forward to hearing it, because it's so interesting. When you were telling me, I was just so fascinated. There's so many aspects to it, and it's really interesting. So looking forward to hear your presentation.
Thank you. We're looking.
Okay, I've got someone come in. I'm just going to go and see whether they have got their presentation up. Okay, so if I go off the screen, it's just because I'm checking on them. Okay. Okay, no, they are not presenting. The two others who are meant to be presenting, they've not joined us yet. Okay, what I'm going to do is, they have not joined in, and I don't want to delay it, because if we make a start now, then you will have an opportunity to a bit more time, because others have not joined in yet. Okay, so I'm going to let you start your presentation. Okay, we normally give you about 15 minutes with 5 minutes for questions. However, because we don't have anyone else, so the only two people going to do the presentation will be you and me. So I'm going to give you the time to do it. If you want to do a bit longer, you're welcome to do so. Okay? All right. You can start when you are ready to start.
Okay, thank you. I prepared for 15 minutes, but I can see yes. How it goes. So our topic today is, it's a very focused part of our research. We're looking at highly skilled female family migrants in Belgium, and a recently introduced directive called the Single Permit. We will talk about it in the course of it. We already introduced ourselves, so I'll skip that part.
Okay.
Seem to be, yeah. So how we first present our primary questions and talk through our methodology. We explain why we think female family migrants are an important group to talk about, background of the Single Permit Directive, the academic context within which we place our research, and a little bit about the preliminary results. So this is an ongoing research project. So we have interviewed a certain number of people so far. So we base this conversation on that. We see our research as a sort of pyramid, in that this very focused project that we are talking about today, it feeds into broader questions. So we begin by looking at how being categorized as family migrants, so this very specific category shapes the professional trajectories of highly skilled female migrants in Belgium, female family migrants. We then open that up to see how the social cultural biases towards women, and especially family migrants, are embedded in this category, which in turn impacts the access that is determined by it. And both these questions bring us to a broader theoretical argument about the normative acceptance of migration categorization itself. And we try to question how these categories impact broader discourses on migrants and migration. Our research project is part of a broader Hummingbird project, which looks at gaps and new theorizations for migration research. But for this particular project, we have done specifically semi-structured interviews, because our starting point is the subjective understanding of highly skilled female migrants, and we want to understand how they see themselves in the Belgian labor market. How we've defined our group is there are some very clear categories. They have to be third country nationals and partners of third country nationals, highly skilled between 25 to 35. But where we differ from the administrative category is that we are also including family migrants who have moved to be with their partners, but are not necessarily here on the family reunification visa. So we've opened the category out to experience and not only administration. We will also talk to stakeholders, policymakers, public employment service officers, to better understand the context of the Belgian labor market and what they see as barriers for family migrants. In terms of statistical data, one of our preliminary understandings is that there is a problem with existing data. So we will look at what we have in terms of work permits and single permits issued to understand the participation of women in the labor market, and also what are the sources of statistical data we can arrive at. Why do we think it's important to talk about family reunification? Because it is one of the most significant streams of migration into Europe. Family reunification, maybe I should explain, is the process of when a migrant moves to a specific country to join someone who sponsors their permit. So it is seen as a sponsored form of migration. There is a primary migrant who then brings others with him or her. As per Eurostat, 43% of all arrivals into Belgium in 2016 were family reunification. So it's a very significant number. 70% of them are women. Why we then divide this into partners of third country nationals and partners of Belgian or EU citizens is because the outcomes are very different. Partners of Belgian or EU citizens have automatic access to the labor market. They get something called a type A card, which means they can have any kind of employment immediately. Partners of third country nationals, who are third country nationals themselves, they need to apply for a separate work permit for themselves, which means they first have to find an employer who is willing to do so. This process takes 4 to 5 months, and very often there needs to be a minimum income, which is fairly high. The contract has to be of a specific duration, and the employers have to advertise or explain why they are hiring an international as opposed to a local citizen or an EU citizen. So these things take time, and not many employers are willing to engage, then hire migrants accordingly. In 2019, something called the Single Permit was introduced, which gives family migrants immediate and unconditional access to the labor market. We talk a little bit about the Single Permit. So this is an EU directive. The European Union recognizes the right to work as a primary right, but what the Single Permit did was that it linked the right to work and the right to residence immediately. Typically, these are two separate competencies. So a migrant would apply, or an employer would apply for the work permit, and once that was granted, the process for the right to residence would begin. So this was designed to fast track the application procedure, to streamline it, to make it easier for economic migrants. Under the single permit rule, both competencies are together and you apply for one card. And as a consequence of this rule, which we at the moment from our conversations with policymakers think was not the primary motivation of the policy, is that family migrants get single permits. So if you are a family migrant and you are moving with an economic migrant who has a single permit, you are automatically granted a single permit as well. This was introduced in all other European countries, EU countries, by 2012-2013, but in Belgium it was introduced in 2019, owing to administrative hurdles that are unique to Belgium. Before we understand why the single permit is so significant, it's good to get a sense of how the family migrant is seen in Belgian policy. A lot has been said about how the definition of family is very restrictive in Europe. Family is defined as immediate family members, that's dependent children under the age of 18, and partners or spouses, legally recognized partners or spouses. There has to be a sponsoring partner who has a certain income level and prove that they can provide adequate housing, and that the dependents will not need social assistance from the Belgian government. There's also a mandatory citizenship orientation course in Werkering. And since 2017, family migrants have to provide something called a proof of effort to integrate. So they have to give the municipality something that shows that they've made an effort to participate in society. This can be a job, it can be community outreach, it can be enrolling for a course or learning the language. But through all of this, we see that the idea of dependence permeates the image of the family migrant. They are seen as people who do not have labor market aspirations and have to be legally obliged to participate outside the family domain. So this image is of a very dependent individual. We see this in academia as well, that the migrant family has been seen as a site of conflict of ideas of modernity and tradition, East and West, all these rules regarding whether they'll follow the rules of the host society. They also derive from ideas of class and ethnicity and race. The family migrant is also seen as unproductive. Kaufman has done a lot of work exploring how they are rendered invisible in streams of highly skilled migration. In Belgium, specifically, there are no labor market activations designed for highly skilled female or highly skilled family migrants. There are a few mentoring programs that were introduced recently for highly skilled migrants, but they are not targeted specifically at this group. So this group remains understudied and unrecognized at the policy level. Which brings us back to our preliminary questions. How does being categorized as a family migrant shape the professional trajectories? The women we spoke to, by and large, see themselves as limited by this label. So there's they are resistant to being considered dependent. But in material terms, they see having to apply for a work permit and a lack of labor market opportunities as barriers, as physical barriers to joining the labor market. But they are not passive recipients of this. We found that they look for pathways to accommodate their aspiration. Of course, there's reskilling and deskilling, which is something that has been studied in a lot of migration literature. But what we also found interesting is that women are very aware of the politics of categorization. So they choose to move under other categories, whether to be with their partners, but not as family migrants. So as students or as economic migrants. There were even a few who acquired citizenship through ancestral channels so that they could move to the European Union as independents or on their own term. Of course, there were some who moved to different countries, nearby EU countries, so they form a sort of transnational family unit, which challenges the whole idea of reunification in the first place. And a large majority followed procedures. So they applied for work, they enrolled for public employment service opportunities, which are typically designed for low-skilled job seekers. They've also done unpaid work off the books, set up as entrepreneurs, and many of them opt out of the labor market as well. Now, in this context comes the single permit, which is almost a moment of rupture. Most interviewees see it as a key change regarding their access to opportunities. So the women we spoke to, they were not, it wasn't that they felt they would get a job tomorrow, but it was the fact that they could get any kind of job that they wanted to apply for. So One of the hurdles that they face is that employers ask for local experience, but it is difficult to get if you cannot take up interim jobs or short-term jobs or precarious kinds of employment that were not allowed under the work permit regulations. So the single permit gives them access to that sort of employment, which they see as a critical change in the opportunities they can access. One thing very interesting that feeds into our next question is that they feel the need to mention the single permit on their resumes because there is not a lot of awareness about it among employers. Which brings us to how ideas embedded within the category determine the access that those in that category get. So for the material impact, so we see already that the labor market potential of highly skilled female migrants is a blind spot. The experts that we interviewed were not aware or had not conducted any sort of extensive study on the limitations imposed by work permits. So the fact that there is legal right to work was seen to mean that there was equal access. Now, lack of labor market activations for highly skilled female migrants is something that comes up as well. Very few countries collect data on the educational qualifications of incoming migrants other than economic migrants. So we tried to get a sense of what is the skill level of family migrants, but that's something that does not exist already. And I think Belgium started collecting data very recently. So that's something that we hope to analyze. And there were no information campaigns on the single permit. So though the people that seem to think of it as the most valuable outcome are the family migrants, the Belgian policymakers haven't really had any sort of outreach for them. Most of the people that we spoke to heard about it accidentally or in the process of going to the city hall. A few of them heard about it through their partners' employers or their own employers. So there was no official channel reaching out to them. Which brings us to what we hope is the broader discussion of our project, which is how does a normative acceptance of migration categories shape discourses on migration? So for all of us here, we are talking about highly skilled migrants, for example, or family migrants, but they don't necessarily see themselves within just that one category. All the concepts that we work with don't capture the complex and dynamic experiences of migrants, of human life and migration projects. In fact, on the other hand, what we see is that these categories limit them. So they restrict them with in terms of what access they get, what things they can do or not do, what rights they have. So then the question becomes, how do we as researchers accommodate these tensions? We need categories in order to study them, but how do we study or how do you create policy without compromising the fact that migrants are constantly coming up against these categorizations? And thank you for listening. That's our presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. I'm going to see whether anyone has any questions to ask you. Just give a minute.
Yeah.
Nobody seems to unmute their so what I've got a few questions to ask you. The first one is, you mentioned that you are using semi-structured interviews. So how did you actually develop the questions for the semi-structured interviews?
Mm-hmm.
And what was your was it based on previous research, or was it based on some study that was undertaken that you used that as a format for your interviews itself?
Thank you for your question. So it was a two-step process. Actually, we have, like I said, this is an ongoing research project. We have engaged with a lot of these topics before, but we did a lot of theoretical research when the Hummingbird project began. So we started with looking at a lot of theory around different kinds of migration, so gendered migration, highly skilled migration, but we also did some expert interviews. We spoke to people who were involved in the implementation of the single permit. We did maybe not test interviews, but we had some initial interviews that were more open-ended than the final questionnaire that we created. So we did test them, and we now have a list of questions that are both direct, so there are some specific questions about the single permit, about their background, but then there are open-ended questions about their experiences on the labor market.
So how many questions do you have, and how long are the interviews itself?
We have 15 questions, and then we have some open-ended towards the end. If, of course, we leave it open to conversation. It takes about, a typical interview takes about 30 minutes, but we have had interviews go on longer. We have been doing them online because of COVID.
Okay.
So I imagine that in person it would take, the time frame would be very different. So.
And are all the interviews conducted in English?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to give someone and anyone else an opportunity to ask any questions. If not, I've got another question to ask you. Can I ask anyone who would like to ask a question to unmute, please? Okay, so my other question that I would like to find out is the findings from this research that you have conducted. Where have you presented your findings? Have you published any papers or in the process of publishing your findings?
Yes, this is the first presentation that we are making, but it's an ongoing research project. So we aim to publish, but this is the first presentation on this specific topic.
On this one. So following this, do you have any plans to publish? Because I think it's a very interesting study, firstly, but I also think that you have got some very valuable data and very valuable information there that would be useful to share.
Thank you. And maybe
Tuba?
Oh, yeah, if I may. Yeah, okay. Is it still me? Yeah, okay. Now it's better.
It's maybe I'll just leave.
Maybe. Okay. Yes, definitely that's the goal, and why we call them the preliminary analysis, because we're still in the data collection.
Yes.
But it was very important to get some feedback. We really hope to get some more questions. But yeah, we are working on a paper. It's a working paper now. It's definitely going to become a journal article.
Right.
And I do feel that we can do even going beyond that, because it's also very much policy oriented. So we are thinking of also developing a policy brief on that. Yeah, it's very specific for Belgium, but the institutes that we're working with are very interested in that.
Okay.
And this is just the first step of our research. We started with a very specific group, the highly skilled family migrants, but we also have very similar but different groups. Let's say we would also like to work with refugee family migrants, especially the females. So this is just the very first step of a series of questions.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. It's really very encouraging.
Yes, I think the data that was presented is really highlighted.
You're muted, so we can't hear you, Mala.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm not muted. What's gone wrong? Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
I think you've highlighted some issues there which are very relevant. I don't think many people would have recognized it, and you've made it very clear the difference between the migrants from international or from third world countries compared to EU countries. So you've got some really valuable distinction and data that will be very interesting for people to read and to know about. So yeah, think about publishing, because I think that will, you could, this is your preliminary findings, and there's nothing that stops you from publishing your preliminary findings. It could be a paper, in a working paper, that later you follow up with your other findings. Do you know, you can always continue that publication by collecting more data and then publishing on that, and then collecting more data and publishing on it. But I think it's very interesting, very valuable information that you have found. So think about it.
Thank you. That's very encouraging.
Yeah, just a paper, just an article. Yeah, because in your presentation, you have already very distinctly, can you hear me?
Yeah.
In your presentation itself, you're very distinctly distinguished certain aspects and certain key points that are valuable. So you already can use your presentation to be a format for you writing your paper.
Okay.
Something to think about.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I think you should. Because I think you've got some really valuable data there that people will be interested to read and to know and to find out.
But definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. And well done. Well done.
Thank you.
Well done.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to check about the next person.